Well, hello, and thank you so much for joining us for Cleaning Up Toxic Public Discourse for Meaningful Engagement. I want to thank our co-sponsors for today's webinar, the American Planning Association and the National Coalition for Dialogue and Deliberation. This is obviously a really important topic. We are at over 1,500 registrants for today's webinar, so obviously this is something that's really affecting a lot of agencies across the country. My name is Dave Biggs. I am the Chief Engagement Officer here at MetroQuest, and I am pleased to be your host for today's webinar. I would like to begin by just going through today's agenda. I'm going to share a little story about when I realized things were changing in the public engagement space dramatically. And I'm going to turn it over to our featured presenter today, Jim Hoggan, who is going to talk about the toxic state of public discourse and how it got that way and some ideas on how to fix it. And then I'm going to come back on and I'm going to talk specifically about ideas for detoxing public engagement, particularly around government-related planning projects, which is our focus here at MetroQuest. And then we're going to open it up for a Q&A. So at any time during the webinar, if you have a question, don't hesitate to type it into the question box in your GoToWebinar panel. We will get to as many of those questions live during the webinar as we can. And anyone that we're not able to get to, we will follow up with you directly after the webinar. So here is actually the moment that I realized that things were changing, caught on videotape. This is me at the front of a room facilitating a public engagement process, looking absolutely terrified because what I'm looking at is a room full of people where, unbeknownst to me, prior to that workshop, a group of people got together and studied a manual on how to disrupt a public meeting effectively. And holy smokes, were they effective. This is what I was looking at right there. So this is a group of people that just completely derailed that public meeting, brought cameras to it, I might add, and just look at the look on my face. So that's when I started realizing there's a different climate that is brewing that we're dealing with in our public engagement activities. And then since that, you can see I'm a lot younger in that picture. We have been focusing more on online public engagement at MetroQuest, but so much has happened in the online space, and we see articles like this where social media is starting to become much more self-aware that they might be contributing to the problem as well. So that kind of set up a series of investigations that we've done at MetroQuest, and certainly collaborations with people like James Hoggan, who is really one of my heroes in this space. I have been colleagues with Jim for many years, and I'm a big fan of his work. I quote him all the time, and he is the author of, among other wonderful books on the topic, I'm Right and You're an Idiot, the toxic state of public discourse and how to clean it up. One of my favorite books, and he's going to be talking about that and among other things. So I'm going to turn it over to Jim now. So Jim, are you there?
I am, and thank you for that introduction, Dave, and for the invitation to speak, and thanks to all of you for joining us to listen. I know that all of us would agree that a healthy public square is a public good that all of us should respect and defend. But more and more, that doesn't seem to be our attitude these days. In 2003, I was running a large public relations firm in Vancouver, British Columbia. And something unusual happened. I was asked onto the board of Canada's most influential environmental group. And it was unusual because my firm was basically represented the establishment. We represented the provincial government, municipal governments, universities, hospitals, We even represented the cruise ship industry and oil and gas industry. So I certainly wasn't an environmentalist. But, you know, as part of my business, I was on a lot of boards. I was on the board of the Dalai Lama Center for Peace and Education and the Alzheimer's Society. And so I joined this board. And when I get on a board, I read my board package. If somebody comes, some famous scientist comes to speak to us at dinner, I listen to him. I read reports, books, and inform myself about the subject matter of the charity that I'm on the board of. And this was something, though, as I started to read and learn more, that I really wasn't prepared for. You know, I'm not really an environmentalist. I'm a business guy, but very quickly I started to realize that these environmentalists weren't quite as crazy as I thought they were. And I came to understand how serious these problems are. The warming of our planet, the way we're driving record levels of species to extinction, the rapid destruction of our oceans. And as a communications person, when I looked at the state of public discourse, you would never know it. You'd never know that we had these serious problems when you looked at not just the state of public discourse, but public policies to address these problems. And so as a communications person, I began to wonder, why is it, despite all of this scientific evidence, that we're doing so little to address these serious environmental problems that we're causing? And that's why I decided to write this book. I went to MIT, I went to Harvard, to Yale, to Oxford, to Columbia University. I interviewed cognitive scientists, social scientists, political philosophers, public intellectuals of all sorts. I even interviewed the Dalai Lama in Dharamsala. And I asked them why it was that we were listening to each other shout about these environmental problems rather than listening to what the evidence was trying to tell us. Like, what did they think? Like, how is it that we managed to get ourselves to a point where facts don't seem to matter? And how could we get ourselves back to where they would matter once again? And why all the name calling and ad hominem attacks and kind of craziness in people's behavior? So one of the things I've learned, I've been in the public relations business a long time, and one of the things I've learned is that no matter how articulate you are, no matter how well informed and how strong your message is, if you don't understand the barriers to communications well, then you're not going to be as effective as you otherwise might be. And so a lot of what I'm going to say is really trying to explain part of the problem that we're facing with this growth in warlike public engagement and unyielding one-sidedness in the public square. Let me give you an example of the kind of thing that I ran across when I eventually became chair of the David Suzuki Foundation, and I was also chair of Al Gore's climate project in Canada. So I was right at the center of a lot of energy and transportation, development, climate issues. But let me give you an example of the kind of craziness that I would run into. In October of 2014, the New York Times wrote an article about a Washington political consultant named Richard Berman. Berman had been speaking in Colorado Springs at an event sponsored by the Western Energy Alliance, which was a group of energy companies involved in hydraulic fracturing. And in his speech, Richard Berman said, oil and gas industry officials need to exploit emotions like fear, greed, and anger and turn them against environmental groups. His speech was secretly recorded, oddly, by one of the oil executives who was so offended by what he was saying. And this oil executive eventually leaked this tape to the New York Times. one of the things that Berman said in this speech was, think of it as an endless war against environmentalists. You can either win ugly or lose pretty. He was at this time trying to raise $3 million for an advertising and public relations campaign called Big Green Radicals. His colleague who was speaking with him said, there's nothing the public likes more than tearing down celebrities and playing up the hypocrisy angle. And he showed them billboards that they were planning on running in Pennsylvania that featured Robert Redford, and with these taglines, he demands green living but flies on private jets. Now, Berman is famous for claiming that environmental groups are funded by Russian oil interests. He actually set up his own EPA. It actually stands for the Environmental Policy Alliance, and its purpose is to uncover the funding and the hidden agenda of environmentalists and conservation groups. Washington insiders call Richard Berman Dr. Evil because his aggressive campaigns that are designed to demonize not just environmental and conservation groups, but uncontroversial groups like the Humane Society and Mothers Against Drunk Driving and green building groups, sporting and fishing groups who are concerned about pollution. I'd like to say that this is just a weird outlier of an example, but I have come across since the early 2000s, literally hundreds of examples of this kind of over-the-top rhetoric. And so I asked these people I was interviewing for my book, what is this? And one of the first people I talked to, his name was Alex Himmelfarb. He's a Canadian social scientist, and he was secretary to the cabinet, and clerk of the Privy Council in Canada, which is the highest advisor to government in our country. He's advised 3 Canadian prime ministers. And I asked him what he thought about these campaigns, and this is what he said. It kind of surprised me. He said, this is not about persuasion. The strategy is to actually minimize public spaces where dialogue might occur, and where it does occur, confuse it, obscure it, and the idea is really to kill debate, not to foster it. They're not really trying to convince you of anything. The strategy is to make it seem as if all the proponents for change are pursuing their own special interests and sow doubt that anybody's telling the whole truth. Around the same time, I talked to Jason Stanley, who teaches philosophy of language and propaganda at Yale. And he said that this kind of language that Berman and people like him use is not so much about making substantive claims as it is about silencing. The idea, he said, is to silence people by making them seem grossly insincere and undermining public trust in them, so nothing they say can be taken at face value. He said Fox News engages in silencing when it describes itself as fair and balanced to an audience that's perfectly aware that it's neither. The effect is that if Fox News can be fair and balanced, that basically means there's no such thing as fair and balanced, that there's no possibility of balanced news, that everything is just propaganda, everything is biased, everything is partisan. So polluting the public square with this kind of rhetoric suggests there are no facts, there is no objectivity, and everybody's just trying to manipulate you for their own particular interests. I afterwards interviewed a fellow named Jonathan Haidt, he's a psychologist who studies this social psychology of teams. He told me that human beings are tribal, and it's tribalism that drives a lot of this discord in public discourse. He said we're oriented by birth to band together into teams. And that if you can get people to engage in the psychology of a team, then open-minded thinking just shuts down. He said, and I'm just quoting him here, our righteous minds have been designed by evolution to unite us into teams, to divide us against other teams, and to blind us to the truth. We're divided in these highly polarizing ways, not because some of us are good and others are evil, but because our minds were designed for groupish righteousness. Another guy I interviewed, his name Dan Kahan, he teaches at Yale Law School. He said, it's worse than that. We actually want to be misled. Kahan studies something he calls cultural cognition, which is the tendency that individuals who belong to groups have to conform their beliefs about disputed matters of fact to their cultural beliefs, their cultural identities. He said that we resist information that threatens our identities. We develop elaborate rationalizations to justify our beliefs, even if they're false and evidence points strongly in the other direction. So if evidence comes along that threatens the beliefs of my group, I don't change my beliefs, I change the evidence. So when scientific evidence is cloaked with team meaning, our minds close. When we massage this kind of my side bias into science, we convince people this isn't something that people like us believe. If you believe this, you can't be one of us, you must be one of them. And loss in faith in public discourse is the outcome. And so, going back to my point about understanding what the obstacles are, misinformation is not at the toxic heart of propaganda. Tribalism is. I interviewed this amazing woman who wrote a book. Her name was Carol Tavris. She wrote a book called Mistakes Were Made, But Not By Me. She told me that the moment we make a decision about anything, we begin to look and see all the reasons we were right about that decision. And we start to overlook and forget the information that suggests we were wrong. She told me that self-justification protects us from the uncomfortable feeling of cognitive dissonance that comes from recognizing that we've made a mistake. And she said the more time and effort and faith and public face we attach to any of our decisions, the harder it is to admit we're wrong. We find ways to defend our mistake rather than face the alternative, which is to admit I'm a good, smart, decent person, and I just did something stupid, unethical, or incompetent. So, and then she said that this is a very powerful force in people, this avoidance of cognitive dissonance, this feeling of having two conflicting views of ourselves. She says it's just as powerful as thirst and hunger. Here's a quote from her. The greatest danger we face on the planet is not only from bad people doing corrupt, evil, and bad things, but also from good people who justify the bad, evil, and corrupt things they do in order to preserve their belief that they are good, kind, and ethical people. And so it's not just the bad actors that cause polarization. You can be right, completely right on the facts and the evidence, and be a highly polarizing figure because of the way you engage. And what happens when people on the right side of an issue cause high levels of polarization, it's because they've fallen into something that Roger Connor calls the advocacy trap, which happens when, if I take a position or I believe in something and I say something about it publicly and someone disagrees with me, and I try to correct them, try to correct misinformation and what they're saying, and they persist, very quickly I start to look at the person not just as wrong, but as a wrongdoer. And before you know it, as you fall into the advocacy trap, it becomes like a battle between good and evil, that I'm David and they're Goliath, and there's something terribly wrong with these folks. Eventually, they're not just wrong, they become wrongdoers. We perceive them as aggressors. They turn from opponents into enemies. And eventually, our enthusiasm about defeating our opponent becomes more important than our original purpose. It's difficult to collaborate with someone you consider untrustworthy or despicable. And so the advocacy trap, when we fall into it, becomes like this perpetual shoving match, an endless battle between good and evil. And the only way to escape the advocacy trap is choosing a stance of respect, empathy, and compassion. People can be completely wrong about something and somehow just be decent people who got it wrong. As George Orwell said, one defeats the fanatic precisely by not being a fanatic oneself. I interviewed this amazing woman. Her name is Karen Armstrong, and she won the TED Prize in 2008, and they gave her $200,000 to make the world a better place. And she went out, interviewed all these spiritual leaders from around the world, and wrote a book called The Charter for Compassion. Anyway, this is what she said to me. She was talking about the golden rule, which is the subject of her book. She said, look into your own heart, discover what gives you pain, and then refuse under any circumstances whatsoever to inflict that pain on anyone else. Never treat others as you would not like to be treated yourself. We must speak out against injustice, but not in a way that causes more hatred. Remember what St. Paul said, charity takes no delight in the wrongdoing of others. Now, she also said that we live in a secular society, so when we hear this kind of thing, it sounds really kind of religious. And but she's saying that a lot of this point of view of the golden rule goes back to like Confucius. And leaders like spiritual leaders like Buddha and Jesus and Confucius, they had communities to take care of, communities that lived in really dangerous times. And so this kind of advice from the golden rule was really a kind of a safety advice in some ways, and a social advice. So it's also practical. It's not just something that we think about on Sunday. Anyway, a few years ago, I had this amazing experience where I was asked to, for years, I studied Buddhism, and I was, raised a Catholic, and but for years I've been interested in Buddhism. And one man in particular, his name is Thich Nhat Hanh, and I got a phone call in my office from someone saying, Thich Nhat Hanh's organization would like you to take care of the communications around his visit to Vancouver. And I thought, oh my God, this is amazing. I've been trying to go to his courses for a long time and had not been able to get in because they're always sold out. So I said, absolutely happy to help, pro bono, but I really would like to be able to come to the course. So I got to go to this course. But as this process unfolded, Thich Nhat Hanh decided he wanted to meet David Suzuki. So I got this phone call, and I ended up setting up this gathering where David Suzuki and I and the mayor of Vancouver, Gregor Robertson, had tea with Thich Nhat Hanh at UBC. And he's a great environmentalist, and we were talking about environmental problems. And he said to David and to Gregor and I, he said, you don't need to tell people they're destroying the planet. You need to deal with the despair. And then he started talking about the inner ecology and how we should meditate because that would make us better environmentalists. And so I said to him, you're not saying that David Suzuki shouldn't be an activist, are you? I mean, Canadians expect him to speak up on behalf of the environment. And he looked at me, and it's hard to describe this experience because he was sitting a couple of feet away from me. And he had this kind of look in his eyes. I sort of felt like he was like peering into my soul. And he said, speak the truth, but not to punish. Speak the truth, but not to punish. And I thought, wow, it kind of felt like somebody had punched me in the solar plexus. And this was all filmed, and I was walking off the stage afterwards, and my wife was in the front row, and she said, you heard what he said, right? You heard what he said, speak the truth, but not to punish. And it's something that I've thought about ever since, that it's this aphorism that is highly informative for people who find themselves in the midst of this toxic, polluted public square. That you can't shy away from what has to be said, but at the same time, you have to have the right intentions behind what you're saying. And I have an enormous amount of appreciation for that advice. And not long after that, I ended up going to India, to Dharamsala, and spent some time with the Dalai Lama. Spent about a week. And he said to me, I asked him this question. I said, I wanted to ask him a question about propaganda, and I said, you have been the subject of propaganda your entire life. Chinese saying all these terrible things about you being a demon and whatever. And but people believe you. They don't believe the propaganda. I have friends who are climate scientists who are being subjected to propaganda. Do you have any advice for them? And he said, in India, in Tibet, we have this saying, if you fail, try again. Fail again, try again. 9 times fail, 9 times try again. We have to keep trying again, regardless of how many times we fail, because if we stop trying again, then that really is failure. As long as we persist, as long as we patiently continue, then we eventually succeed. He said, I've been talking to people about compassion, the power of compassion, for 50 years. And I just now feel like people are starting to listen. Anyway, at the end of this whole interview, we stood up and people were shutting the cameras off, and the Dalai Lama reached over and tried to put his finger on my forehead. And he said, we like to think the Western mind is more sophisticated, but in Tibet, we go with the heart, and that might be stronger. So maybe if we take the Western mind and the Tibetan heart together, we can solve these problems like climate change. That what we need is more warm-heartedness, more compassion. So I need to wrap up, but what I'd like to say is that the Dalai Lama's advice about compassion, in my view, is very practical advice. It's not some big kind of up in the clouds, up in heaven type of thing that none of us could achieve unless we're a saint or something. To me, I thought, like, what does that actually mean to be more warm-hearted to people? I mean, the problem that we face is that in a public square that's been polluted in this highly polarized way, with all this unyielding one-sidedness and unreasonableness, facts don't change minds the way we think they do. Peter Senge, when I interviewed him, told me that the quality of the intervener determines, or the quality of any intervention is determined by the inner quality of the intervener. And so I had been, as I was writing this book, thinking about how do you clean up this public square, which is like a big job for one person. And I started to think, it's much smarter for me to think about working on the board in my own eye and not so much on the sliver in somebody else's. And so what I, as a communicator, focused on were these themes that I heard from people, particularly this idea that we need to take a closer look at how we tell stories, right? We know from cognitive psychology that people process information in stories. The human mind creates meaning through stories, through emotion, through stories that stir up feelings and values. In a fight, facts always lose to emotions. Will almost always lose to emotions. And so leaders, public figures, need to be able to participate in the emotional dialogue. And I think that in order to be a storyteller that is persuasive to people, we need to start with deep listening. And by that, what I mean is this. If we want people to hear our argument, we have to first be able to hear theirs. And the process of deep listening starts by letting people know that we realize that we haven't been listening in some form or other. We say that. Letting them know that we care about what they think. And then we listen. And we listen for what it is that people are feeling. We listen for people's values. We let people kind of get stuff off their chest and empty their hearts. If they say something bitter, we don't react. If they say things that are wrong, maybe we postpone the time for correction to a later time. We listen for values and emotions. We listen until people feel that they have been completely heard. The idea is that we want to listen enough and we want to hear so well that we can repeat back to people their point of view in a way that they realize that we really have actually heard them. So this is like the kind of step before we kind of move to our story. But I think what ends up happening is you start to open up this, your own personal awareness of the emotional, what Paul Slovic calls the whisper of emotion that underlies so much of the so many of these challenges that we face, where people are very angry, not because they're stupid or idiots, not because they're necessarily, they just want to be disruptive, but because they feel they have no influence, they have no control. Deeper listening, and in the way that it's structured in public engagement, is an essential tool to show respect and start to create some common ground where you can start to have more conversations about the facts and the evidence. And so in my view, what I'm trying to do personally is be more kind of pluralistic in the stories that I tell, in the sense that I leave more room for other people in them. And most important, when we're talking about risk communications will fail. Communications in disputes will fail unless it's a two-way process, unless people have the sense that they really have a legitimate role. That in this kind of two-way process, you're basically participating in an emotional dialogue where both people feel that they have something worthwhile to contribute, and they feel that their views are being respected. Being right is not enough. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Jim. That was exciting. I learn something every time I hear you. And folks who are on the line, how lucky am I that I get to have lunch with this guy? I just love listening to the thoughts that come out of his head. And for those of you who are participating today, we're going to give away 2 signed copies of his book at the end of the webinar, so stick around for that. And for the rest of you who aren't so lucky, we will provide you with links on how to get the book yourself. So with that, I'm going to shift now for just a little while to government agencies and planning efforts, where we spend most of our time at MetroQuest. We are affiliated with so many great organizations, planning organizations and public participation organizations, where I serve as a best practices researcher. We also have the luxury of having so many direct clients of MetroQuest that I get a window into what is going on across the country in terms of public engagement. And so we do a lot of work at MetroQuest on trying to summarize what we've learned about best practices along the way. And so with that, one of the things that we did recently is at the International Association for Public Participation National Conference, we got together a whole room full of the best thinkers in public participation to brainstorm how do we address this toxicity that we're experiencing. And we did something similar at the American Planning Association National Planning Conference. We had at the end of the standing room only session, where there was 50 people standing at the back of the room, we had a thought wall exercise where we collected over 500 ideas in various categories on how to detoxify or respond to some of this toxic public engagement that is happening. So among many other things that we talked about different strategies that agencies are using for public engagement, and how public meetings can be a great place for people to share ideas and learn about each other's views. They're so vulnerable to co-optation by these forces, and I think we've all experienced that in our work. Social media can be a wonderful way to amplify the message and get the word out there that the government agencies are looking for public input. However, it can decline into a cesspool of rhetoric, and there's a lot of biasing that goes on as a result of social media bubbles and so forth. And in a similar but slightly different way, online forums tend to be echo chambers for the highly motivated people to dominate a process, and there's a lot of biasing that happens there as well. So during those sessions and in interviews with hundreds of agencies, we have compiled a list of the most important lessons learned in how to detox public engagement. I'm going to give you 7 today. We're going to be sharing a guidebook with you at the end that has 21 tips that were collected during those discussions. So number 1, gain clarity on issues early. It's so important to really get ahead of some of these issues, to really understand what is on people's mind before you start making decisions, before you start even engaging the public, to get together and understand what the nature of the issues are before you start writing copy, before you start engaging the public. And Tanya Zwollen and Susan Hopkins had a great session at the American Planning Association conference, and they really emphasized this topic, where they first said that in order for valid public engagement to exist, there has to be 2 things present. Firstly, there has to be a decision to be made that is not yet made, and there has to be an opportunity for the public to in some way influence that decision. If those 2 things aren't present, then it is not a valid opportunity for public engagement. And then that drives a number of things that can lead to outrage or make the outrage worse. And number one on their list was late engagement, engaging too late in the process where the public who shows up is feeling like these decisions have already been made. What's the point in me saying anything here? That really causes outrage. And there's a number of other points that they made, but those were the top points that they really emphasized. The second lesson learned in detoxifying public engagement is to focus the conversation as much as possible on local community priorities. It's very easy for agencies to kind of stick with their own decisions that need to be made, or planning, constituency and regulations that they're under, but it's really for the public to engage. They are only able to engage on things that are important to them. So the more you can focus the conversation on what's important to the community, the more engagement there will be in that way that Jim was talking about, the emotional connection that people will have to the decisions that are being made. That's really where you get the engagement that's true to the people that you're talking to. And it's important in that process to ask structured questions so they not only have a way of meaningfully providing input that can be used in the process, but they understand what is on the table. And maybe you're raising some things in these structured questions that they might not be considering, that is gonna expand their worldview a little bit, to not be thinking just about that one thing that's driving them in the process, but thinking about a number of things that the agency is balancing in the planning process. Number three is creating a safe place. You can't imagine, for people who are attending public meetings or participating in online forums, how intimidating that process is for people who have maybe a different opinion and want to share it, but they just have this sense and this realistic sense that people are going to jump all over them and criticize them for having that different opinion. So it's important that you have an opportunity to provide this safe place for people to feel like they're not going to be exposed to that. And one of the things that you can do at public meetings that we came up over and over is drop the mic. The microphone is just an opportunity for people to dominate the process, but rather have table discussions where people are spending more time listening to each other, where you have rules of engagement that people are following, where people aren't able to influence or intimidate others to that extent. And it's important to offer a safe alternative for people who would be intimidated by that process to participate using strategies like online surveys. Number four, engage the masses. We all realize it, that we're not hearing from the average public when we're engaging at public meetings. Those are a very small and narrow cross section of the demographic. So the more you can understand, the breadth of opinions in the community, the better. There's always going to be people who are negative, and there's always people that are positive, but the vast majority of people are in the moderate middle. It dramatically affects your level of motivation to participate. It's not surprising that people who show up to public meetings are angry, because that is the most important factor that motivates them to participate. If you are finding that your public meetings aren't attracting people who are moderate or even people who are positive, it's probably because the barrier to participation just isn't high enough for those people to really get out of their couch. So if you want to engage the full spectrum of opinions in the community, it's important to lower the barrier to participation to the extent possible. And in that way, we're really trying to, with MetroQuest and all of the things that we've heard from these wise folks in public participation, engage the silent majority to uncover what your community really feels about planning priorities. And one of the things that we have found to be so effective is to reduce the amount of time that you're asking people to participate. We found that about 5 minutes is the right length for an online survey. Much more than that, and people will sort of say, I don't have time for this, and much less, and you're probably not able to get all that much useful information. So 5 minutes tends to be about the right amount of time. And it's so important to allow people to participate when they're able to participate and not have a prescribed time that people have to show up and come and see you. Using a variety of channels is very effective, and probably most importantly, at MetroQuest anyways, we have put so much energy into making the mobile experience delightful, because in most of our experiences, over 50% of the participation will be on mobile devices. And so you have to make that experience as delightful as possible, because remember, you're trying to engage the people who are unmotivated or less motivated. And so anything that you can do to make it delightful is going to be beneficial. One thing that I always keep an eye out for with looking at our clients is who's doing the best promotions. And I love this campaign. Be a little bit fun with your promotions. It goes a long way to engage a broad audience. I love this campaign. All right, Nashville, it's time to pick. This was a visioning process for the city, and they just had so much fun with these campaigns. Click through, take the survey, and see the participation rise. One of the things that you're able to do if you're collecting demographic information is to monitor the results and to see who you're hearing from and perhaps who you're missing. And that allows you to have activities where you go to where people are already going to be, particularly from an underrepresented demographic. And one thing that this allows you to do in terms of the toxicity that we've been talking about is you're going to people who are not there to see you. And so these are the people that are just sort of average, going about their daily lives. Maybe they're at a community event already, and you have a table set up where you're engaging them in a short activity. These are the people who are less motivated because they haven't decided to come and talk about the long-range plan or the corridor strategy or whatever it is that you're working on. So you'll be hearing much broader ideas than if you had planned events. One thing is it's so important to recognize the fact that this toxic dialogue that's going on with the vocal minority, they sound authoritative and very forceful in their communications, which makes other people think, maybe I don't know enough to participate in this. And it's really damaging and polarizing to have this kind of a dynamic that's going on. And so the more you can provide questions that people are able to and feel comfortable answering, but also provide them with the education that they need to feel confident about their answers is so important. So it's not about, as Jim said, it's not about just forcing more data into the process, but making the learning, creating a learning experience. And so with MetroQuest, what we've done to respond to that is we've created these little micro learning moments where you can, for example, you can pick projects and invest in them. And so you can see what the community is thinking about investing in, and you're kept to a particular budget of a number of projects or amount of money spent. So you're sort of embedding in a game-like way the education into a fun and fast experience. I like this one with Truckee Meadows Regional Planning, where they were addressing this question about, do we want housing with more land and less access to services, or housing with less land and more access to services? So it's introducing a trade-off that I can guarantee you 90% of people walking around are just not thinking that that's a trade-off that is being made, but it is indeed something that planners think about. And so the more you can embed those kind of lessons into your experience, the more insightful the answers coming back are going to be. And then there's a variety of ways to kind of gamify, so using scenarios where people can see the pros and cons of different alternatives according to their own top priorities, allows people to self-educate and learn about options and then feel comfortable about the information that they're providing as input. And then, budgeting, you can have games where you can allocate to different amounts of resource to different categories. And it's a fun way of kind of communicating that there are constraints and we need to make priority decisions. So things like visual preference surveys really helps to introduce people to concepts that they might not understand if they were just text-based, and allows people to navigate quickly, but also to provide meaningful input. So those are some ways that we've thought of as being useful to educate the public on decisions. Number 6 is about designing for actionable results, thinking down the line to the director of planning or whoever's presenting the results to decision makers. It's so important that they are armed with qualitative and quantitative information that they can go to their decision makers and say 4 to 5 people felt like this was a positive outcome or a positive choice or a high priority. And so the more you can be delivering quantifiable information in that process, the more confident that they're going to be. And one thing that we have done in this interview process when we're talking with clients is we ask them, so what difference does this make to have this kind of level of engagement and this kind of educational experience? And their experience was it gave courage to decision makers. And I thought that was very interesting, because when we're thinking about planning, we're talking about changing direction, changing policy, and it takes courage to do that. And so providing the data to help decision makers feel courageous to make those decisions is really the fundamental role of public engagement, to make better planning decisions with the blessing of the community. And the last one that I'll mention, it really speaks to what Jim was talking about, sharing the outcomes with compassion. And it's so important and something that is often forgotten. You don't stop the public engagement process when you stop needing something from the public. You stop when you tell the public, here's what we heard from you. Thank you so much for participating. This is what we got out of the community engagement. These were the priority areas, and here's how we are responding to those priorities. So closing the loop on that really goes a long way of building back some of that trust that's been lost and developing a culture where community engagement is actually rewarded and people feel like it was valuable for them to participate. So those were the top 6, top 7. We've got 21 tips that we'll send you in the guide, but those were the most important lessons learned out of that process. Here they are again. So 1 through 7, and stay tuned for that report that we'll send you in the follow-up. I wanted to at least show you an example of these are 2 stories that I just were really resonating with me as I was preparing for this webinar. This process where they were using MetroQuest to help design a new bridge. It was a very controversial project where they had a couple of false starts. They thought they were building this amazing bridge, and the community just hated it. They used this process to try to engage people on what their priorities were, and they helped people understand the pros and cons of different alternatives and the trade-offs associated with different decisions. And they engaged people in this wonderful visual preference survey where they actually had people feel like they were designing different options. And lastly, they asked people some demographic questions. The reason that this one really resonated for me, and I wanted to show it to you, is the result of this massive engagement that they did online was they discovered that they were building the wrong bridge. The bridge that they actually ended up agreeing on after the public engagement was far cheaper than the bridge that they were building, and it met the community needs so much better than the one that was causing so much outrage. At the other end of the planning spectrum, here's a long-range planning process for the area, metropolitan Tampa, Hillsborough County. And this one, again, is an interesting story where they're engaging people on a variety of different priorities for the long-range transportation plan. They're asking people to look at different scenarios, and you can see that each of these scenarios comes with both pros and cons. And so when I say, yeah, I like this scenario, I'm doing so being fully aware that there's trade-offs. And then we've got some visual preferences and a wrap-up. The result of this particular scenario, or this particular public engagement, was a complete redesign for the strategy for the metropolitan area. They were planning on building a major highway as a bypass to the city. They discovered that no, the priorities were misplaced, and they decided to focus more heavily on transit as a result of the public engagement. So again, millions, or in fact, probably billions of dollars worth of investment redirected as a result of engaging the public a little bit more closely and hearing the true values of the community. So with that, I'm going to pop open a quick poll before we open it up for Q&A. If you are interested in more information, I'm just going to ask you here what information, when you logged onto the webinar, or as you are in your process for improving your public engagement process, what information would be useful for you as you go down that path? So would you like feedback on your particular public engagement plan? Would you like to understand more feature? I didn't spend very much time at all discussing any of the features of MetroQuest. Would you like to understand that a little bit better? Would you like pricing information for what you've seen with MetroQuest, because it is customized for each particular size of organization? Because of the nature of this webinar, wasn't able to get into that at all, so happy to provide that. And of course, if you would like a sample online public engagement case study, we're happy to share that with you as well. So I'll give you a few more seconds to weigh in on that. All right. Thank you for that. So as I mentioned, I'm going to be sharing with you the book that we put together with over 100 of the best practitioners in public engagement on detoxing public engagement, and so we'll email you a copy of that. I also wanted to let you know before we open it up for Q&A that our next webinar will be much more applied than this one in terms of the planning topics. It's called Millennials to Boomers, How Michigan DOT Involved 6,300 people in what is normally a pretty difficult topic to engage the public, a long-range transportation plan, with the public so focused on short-term priorities. They were able to break out of that cycle and engage a huge number of people. And they're going to talk about how they did that, what strategies they use for promotions, and all of the strategies that they use to engage that number of people. So now it's my pleasure to invite Jim back up. I know that there is going to be a whole bunch of questions, and we will probably not have time to get to even 10% of them, but let's get to as many of them as we can. Excuse me. So let's just look. Hi, Jim.
Hi.
Welcome back. So let me just look at, as I suspected, Jim, there is a whole load of questions here. So let me ask you a few. So Jim, what is the one thing I should do when I'm aggressively confronted by a finger-pointing resident at a town hall meeting? So I think you started to touch on some of this, and I can certainly share my experience. But if somebody I assume this person is working for a planning agency, and they've got somebody who's aggressively pointing their finger at them. Any advice for this person?
Yeah, well, God, the questions are always so tough. So I would say essentially the advice I would give that would be consistent with what I've said already is that you don't want to react. And it sounds to me like there's a bit of a process problem with this, that perhaps something needs to be put in place in the process so that something like this doesn't dominate the exchange. When I was a young guy starting my PR business, I had a mentor. We used to call him Grandpa. And I remember one thing he said to me, which was, if you don't tell them, someone else will, and it will be bad. And he was referring to your story or your message. And it just seems to me that we have to be very, very careful not to let polarization invade our story. And in this world, I think what that means is having a process in place that allows for genuine input so that it mitigates against this type of behavior by people.
Interesting. And yeah, that's what we heard from planners as well. They experienced a huge difference in the tone if they started engaging early enough in the process and were very, very clear about the impact that the public could have, what's on the table, what's not on the table. That kind of lack of clarity. People assume that you're going to do whatever the public says, and that's your role as a democratically, elected public agency. So the clearer that you can be about that, I think that kind of allows people to self-correct and to understand what's on the table and maybe what's not on the table a little bit better.
I mean, now, there's some people. There are just some people there's no talking to. But I don't think that's most people, right? I mean, Paul Slovic, who is someone, if you ever get a chance to listen to this guy, he's a fascinating guy. He's an expert on risk communication, and one thing he said was that people see the public as like overly emotional, overreacting, but a lot of the time where that comes from is people start to feel this feeling of dread, which is the biggest emotional predictor of people seeing something as highly risky. And it's driven not by people's irrational belief of a risk, but by the feeling that they are taking the risk and somebody else is getting the benefit, and that they have no input, so they have no control. And that's what drives that feeling. So that's what I meant when I said that part of this could be process, right? And part of it could be that you're just dealing with somebody who's, troubled.
Right. Well, and I think this next question might be talking about about that. This is turning it a little bit. I'm interested to hear what you'd say about this. What are a few ways to practice compassion during emotional dialogues with decision makers who are lacking deep listening skills themselves? So when you're dealing with people that just don't have deep listening skills, what are some ways that you can help to improve their listening?
I mean, I do think that asking open-ended questions and affirming what it is that you've heard helps sometimes to diffuse that kind of situation. I also think that, I remember a number of times in my agency life where we had a big board of a hospital or a government, ministers, and they're all from Missouri, and they just don't believe anything. One of the things that really worked is data. If you can actually bring research, it's hard for people that was my experience. It's easy for them to disagree with my opinion, much harder for them to disagree with like a massive amount of data. So it kind of, again, goes back to process.
Right. Yeah, and just looking through these questions, I'm sorry, folks, we've got too many of them that we're not going to be able to get to them all. But let's take one more question. I want to respect your time, and we're already 5 minutes over. This one is, and many of them are having difficulty with this public meeting format. This question is: in a public meeting, setting the opposition, in a public meeting setting, the opposition often wants to enrage rather than be heard. So how do you communicate listening with empathy in such a large group setting?
Yeah, I don't want to seem naive that, as I said earlier, there's some people that it doesn't matter. You're never going to have any influence on what their thinking is. I'm not suggesting that we go overboard being empathetic or compassionate to Rick Berman, the guy I used in my example. But I do think you do want to be seen to be listening, and you listening to the point that even if somebody doesn't deserve it, because there's more people in the room than the crazy person who's trying to manipulate it that you're talking to. And so I think trying to set up a process where you're showing everyone that you actually are listening, regardless of how unreasonable they might be the objective. And an objective to try to change somebody's mind who's never going to change their mind by being like the Dalai Lama is probably not a good objective.
Right. Yeah, and in my experience, I haven't done it for quite some time because we've turned our focus to online public engagement as our contribution to the process. But when I was running public meetings, I found that it was so important to, even if I vehemently disagreed with what was being said, that I parroted back to them, here's what I heard you say. Did I get that right? And does anybody else have any other opinions on that topic, and invite a discussion around it,
right?
To have them very clearly understand, I heard you, and so I'm not ignoring you. I didn't say I agreed or disagreed with it, but one thing that I will offer as advice is begin your meetings with expectation setting around being fair about the amount of time that each person takes. And I ask people to be particularly compassionate to the people who are shy and don't like to speak. And for the people who are bold and like to dominate, I invite them to listen more and speak less. And for the people who are shy, I invite them to be brave and have people around them encourage them. And so to try to create this expectation up front before things go off the rails. I'm not saying it works every time, because if people have shown up to disrupt the meeting, they're going to ignore those instructions. But it does help in many situations.
So can I just add one thing, Dave? I know you've got to wrap up, but there's an interesting group in New York that's been put together by a psychiatrist there called Smart Politics. And they do these little online training things that go right to this question. Then they put together like a 4 or 5 step process of how you try to deal, how do you go through this listening process and deal with conflict. And I think really, I took the first session, and I'm going to take another one, because I think they're trying to do some really good work. And I think if people just Googled Smart Politics, you'd see some of these, I think it's like $20 to do a 2-hour workshop.
Right, that's excellent. Well, thank you so much, Jim. Really appreciate you spending the time with us today and preparing for this webinar. I know people online are super engaged. There's so many questions. We'll get to as many of your questions and your requests for additional information as possible, as quickly as possible. I wanted to give away a couple of signed books, if I could, Jim. To the winners. We've selected 2 winners here from the participants today, Nicole F. and Eric S. You will both be getting signed copies of Jim's latest book, the 2nd edition of I'm Right and You're an Idiot. For the rest of you, I will send you links to how you can download the book or receive a copy yourself. With that, I do want to wrap it up. Thank you so much, Jim, for sharing your ideas with us today. I really appreciate the time, and I know that based on the reaction of people online today, that it really resonated with a lot of the struggles that I think that planning and public engagement people are facing. They're really on the front lines of this battle. They didn't do anything to create the problems, but they're certainly being forced to deal with it. And so any advice that they can take away from today, I think is going to be really appreciated. There is the credit for people who are collecting AICP credits. And for those of you who have joined us today, thank you so much for participating, and thanks again to you, James.
Thank you.
Take care, everyone.